Every time we have a speaker series, we get such wonderful feedback from it. And Nancy Wofford is third VP, and she's also going to help tonight. But I hope that you all just have a great time and enjoy our wonderful speaker. I really want to introduce her. However, we will leave this to Gretchen Cox. So I'm going to turn over now the program to Gretchen, who has a few things to tell you, little housekeeping issues, before she introduces our speaker. So Gretchen, thank you.
Okay, thank you, President Janet. Hi, everybody. It's so good to see all of you. We're so glad that you could join us tonight. I'm going to start off by just reminding you of some of our upcoming speakers. Next week, we only have a week break between speakers this time. So next week on April 25th, we have Tom Del Beccaro speaking with us. On May 2nd, we will have Steve Frank, who is a political blogger here in California. On May 30th, Dr. Jeff Barkey, who is an MD and is very well versed and has written a book on COVID issues. And he's also very well versed in education matters. He started a charter school here in Orange County, and so he can talk about medical information as well as education. Then on June 12th, which is a Monday, we will have Dr. Douglas Frank, and he will be speaking to us about election integrity. So those are the upcoming speakers that we have so far. Please remember to check our website at CFRW.org to keep updated on these, and also you will continue to get emails reminding you of the upcoming speakers. And we will continue to add names. Just a couple of housekeeping issues before we get started. I just want to remind you, as I always do, please remember to keep yourselves muted so that everybody can hear the speaker and not what's going on in the room behind you. We are happy to have you add questions into the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to do that if you have some questions. Nancy Wofford and I, our third vice president, will go through the questions after our speaker gets done. And then we have a couple other questions as well. And just remember, if we do happen to have some extra time for questions and we unmute you to allow you to ask the questions yourselves, you're just to ask a question. We're not going to have this isn't going to be a debate forum. It's just a simple question and answer. We do plan to finish at 7:30. So if you would like to hang out afterwards and visit with people you haven't seen or talked to for a while, we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes after everything's over. And then one last time, I just want to remind you to keep yourselves muted. I think that covers it. So now I'm so happy to get to introduce to you Susan Shelley, who is an editorial writer and columnist for the Southern California news groups, which encompasses 11 different newspapers, including the Orange County Register and the Los Angeles Daily News. She writes on local, state, and national issues. She also has a radio show that she can tell us about, and she's a frequent guest on various radio shows and TV shows. Susan is also Vice President of Communications for the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. She is a former Assembly candidate from the West San Fernando Valley area, and she's an author. She has several books out there. Susan, I've introduced her before, but I don't think I really knew this until earlier today, but she started her career as an associate producer for the Jeopardy TV show. And I just thought that was so interesting because it's always smart people on that show. So that kind of makes sense. And Susan has for a long time been very generous about giving time to just about any Republican women's club that invited her. And I know she speaks to other groups as well, but she is always available to the Republican women's group. So we are so happy to have you, Susan, with us tonight. And I just want to welcome you.
Thank you, Gretchen. It is a pleasure to be here. And it's so much fun to be with Republican women. It's my pleasure to speak to all of your groups. It's just a delight. If I can get there, if I can physically get there, or if I can Zoom get there, I'm always happy to do it. So I want to talk to you today about the Repeal the Death Tax campaign. I know a lot of you probably collected signatures for this last year. Let me tell you what's going on with it. It's all good news. The original problem developed with Proposition 19 in 2020, because Proposition 19 included a provision that took away the right for parents and children to transfer property without tax reassessment. We had that right since 1986 with Prop 58, which passed overwhelmingly, and it was taken away in the fine print of Proposition 19 in 2020, when everyone thought that was about helping wildfire victims and helping seniors and helping disabled homeowners. It also took away the right for parents and children to transfer a home and a limited amount of other property between each other without having that count as a change of ownership, triggering reassessment and a huge tax bill. So now that's gone. The protection is gone. And when property is transferred from parents to children, it's reassessed to market value with just narrow and capped exceptions. This is terrible. This is affecting apartment buildings and all the tenants in them. When a mom and pop apartment building is passed to the next generation and reassessed to market value in San Francisco, in San Jose, in Los Angeles, in Santa Monica, this is crazy what those new values are. And the new tax bill is 1% of the new market value, plus all the bonds and parcel taxes and whatever else. So this is unaffordable, particularly for buildings that are under rent control, as many older buildings are. And in that instance, the new owners, the next generation, is going to end up having to sell that building because they can't make it pencil out as a business. And then what? What happens to the tenants? Everybody's out. It's going to end up demolished. Proposition 19 could cost us half the affordable housing in California in one generation, as those buildings are passed from parent to child. It's a catastrophe. And for individual homeowners, it's just as bad, because the way Prop 19 is written, a parent can transfer only their principal residence to their kids. The kids can, if the kids move into it within 1 year and make it their permanent primary residence, they get a tax break to an extent. But if the home is worth more than the tax break, they get the tax increase anyway. And it becomes unaffordable because no one can control the value of property in California. Just because your property goes up and you have paper profits doesn't mean you have the income to pay those taxes. So people are being forced to sell family property because of the tax bill. And this has to be fixed. So last year, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association tried to do a signature campaign on a petition for an initiative to repeal the death tax, to change just this portion of Prop 19, not the other parts, but just this. And we fell a little bit short on the signatures. We didn't get as many as we needed. So this year, we have two different tracks that we're working on this. It has to be a constitutional amendment, and there's two ways to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot for voter approval. One is with signatures, but the other is with the legislature. The legislature, by a 2/3 vote in each house, can put a constitutional amendment on the ballot. So we're doing that. It's SCA 4, Senate Constitutional Amendment 4. Jot it down if you have a pen, SCA 4, and call your representatives and please ask them to become co-authors of SCA 4. Because what this will do is put back the old rules. It will put back Proposition 58. So once again, parents and children will be able to transfer a home of any value plus additional property up to $1 million of assessed value. So that covers a duplex, a small restaurant property that a family has invested in. It covers one rental home that somebody owns and has owned for a long time. If it's worth less than $1 million in assessed value on the tax bill, it passes from parent to child without reassessment. And so for building generational wealth, and I'm not talking about Rockefellers and Gettys here, I'm talking about regular people who have invested what their earnings through the years making mortgage payments to buy property because they thought it was a good investment and they wanted to leave something to their kids. And that rental home, maybe that income is dedicated to taking care of somebody's medical expenses or other types of care expenses. Maybe families have made these complicated plans that rely on continuing to have those income properties. Well, they all get reassessed. All the income property gets reassessed upon transfer from parent to child. Trusts do not protect you. There's no protection at all. And it's wrecking people's plans. And it went into effect so quickly, and people didn't even know it was in there. It passed in November. They didn't finish counting the votes till December. It started taking effect in February, just a few months, and people were just caught completely unaware. So SCA 4, if it gets on the ballot, will allow the voters to put back what was lost. And that is really important. So where it stands right now is there was supposed to be a hearing tomorrow in the Governance and Finance Committee. But because there are now some Democrats and others who are interested in co-authoring it, they wanted more time. So they pulled it from the agenda for tomorrow, and they're going to hold a special hearing on SCA 4, which is scheduled, I believe, for May 10th, although that perhaps could change. But there will be a special hearing on SCA 4. And if you call your representatives and you say, please co-author it, and tell them why it's so important, it will make a big difference. You know, when this was put on the ballot in 1986, it was the legislature that put it on the ballot. And it passed the legislature unanimously. Unanimously. Not one opposing vote to creating this parent-child transfer. And then it passed with 75% voter approval. And now it's gone. Got to put it back. 10 years later, they extended the rules to grandparents and grandchildren. If the children's parents were deceased, that's gone too. Putting that back also. So this is really important. If for any reason the legislature will not do this, we are right behind them at Howard Jarvis with another initiative. And let me tell you about this, because this is really exciting. We have found a way to boil this down so that it fits on one page, one 8.5 by 11 one-sided standard letter size piece of paper, a completely legal petition with the correct margins and the correct font size and the correct text and all of it. This enables us to do a different kind of campaign. Instead of having people at tables, instead of having people in front of supermarkets, we can do this electronically. We can send this out by email. We can send this out. We can do this on radio commercials and say, go to the website, click, download, print it, sign it, fill out the declaration of circulator at the bottom, mail it back to us. That's how we're going to do this. We think that's a game changer because grassroots politics has been really sidelined in California by the expense of doing these signature campaigns. You only have 6 months to get a lot of signatures, more than 1 million. And it's very expensive, very difficult. So even when people pay $10, $15 million, they aren't even guaranteed that they're going to make it. So we have to find a way to do grassroots politics the way Prop 13 was done, where ordinary people who are concerned about something in California can band together and solve a problem. Because sometimes the legislature, I know this is a shock to Republican women, but sometimes the legislature doesn't get it done for us. Sometimes what they do is terrible. And that's why we have direct democracy powers and have had them since 1911. Since 1911, if you've ever seen the movie Funny Girl, right around the time that Fanny Brice was on stage, we were creating the direct democracy powers in California. So we have the initiative where voters can write laws and enact them. We have the referendum where we can toss out laws that the legislature has passed that we don't want as voters. And we have the recall, about which nothing more needs to be said. You're all familiar with the recall, and these are all really important. And the legislature is constantly trying to tinker with them and make them more difficult. That's not good. So the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association fights very hard to make sure that we retain our powers of direct democracy. There is another measure that's going to be on the ballot in November of 2024, called the Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Act. And I want to talk to you about this because it's being misrepresented by the League of Cities and the Association of Counties and others as some kind of end of Western civilization as we know it. No. Here's what the Taxpayer Protection Act is about. The cities and the counties would like it to be easier to raise your taxes. And we would like it not to be easier to raise your taxes. And so that's the fight. That's what this is about. The Constitution of California has Prop 13 in it, which says that local taxes for a special purpose need a 2/3 vote of the electorate to pass. That's when the money is restricted to a particular purpose. 2/3 vote. But the courts have been carving loopholes. And the most recent one was in 2017, where the Supreme Court of California sort of kind of suggested, without actually ruling on it, just kind of suggested that if a tax increase is put on the ballot by a citizen's initiative instead of by a city council, maybe the Constitution doesn't apply. And maybe you don't need a 2/3 vote. So this was immediately tested. In San Francisco, 2 members of the city council and county board of supervisors decided they would take a tax increase, and rather than put it through the government body where it would need a 2/3 vote, they said, we're citizens. And in their capacity as citizens, these government officials wrote a tax increase, circulated it for signatures, got it on the ballot, led the campaign for it. It passed with 50.8% of the vote, didn't get anywhere near 2/3, 50.8%, and they declared it passed. This was Proposition C, or Measure C, in June of 2018. It was a tax on commercial leases, commercial property leases in the city of San Francisco. How's that going? And the money was dedicated to the special purpose of child care and early education. Under the Constitution, that would need a 2/3 vote. Under this interpretation, this loophole, it squeaked through with a simple majority. This is happening all up and down the state. And so far, the appellate courts have looked at this and they've said, sure, fine, why not? I'll tell you why not. Because people are taxed enough in California. That's why not. And because the Constitution says 2/3. That's why not. So what does the Taxpayer Protection Act do? It says 2/3, a 2/3 vote for local special taxes, regardless of how it gets on the ballot, closing that loophole. And it also adds more protection from statewide taxes. Currently, statewide taxes need a 2/3 vote in each house of the legislature, plus the governor's signature. Well, if this passes, it would also need a vote of the people. It would have to get majority vote of the electorate before that tax increase could take effect. That would have protected us from the gasoline tax increase and the vehicle registration tax increase. Would have protected us from that. So what we have right now with a supermajority in Sacramento is they have the ability to arm twist those last few votes that they need to get a tax increase through, and then we're just stuck. And what happens to the state when we do that? The more expensive it gets to run a business and to live in California, the more people leave. The more people leave, the less money there is in the treasury, the more they raise the taxes. Rinse and repeat. And this is not fiction. Even the people who wanted to say it was fiction have had to admit it's really happening. We lost a congressional seat. We've lost at least 500,000 people net out of the state of California to other states. And this is real. This is real. And last year we had a surplus, but this year we have a deficit. And if high earning people leave the state of California and stop paying that 13.3% personal income tax rate, and they go to one of the other states for lower taxes, and they have 49 other choices if they want lower taxes, California loses out. And if businesses leave and all those high salary jobs leave, same problem. So we really need to have policies in California that stop increasing the cost of energy and stop increasing the cost of living and stop increasing the cost of housing. We need to do something about all these regulations and all these fees and all these policies that don't accomplish anything, but just cost you a lot of money. We need to do something about that. So I want to talk a little bit about probably the #1 concern in so many cities, which is homelessness, because there's a solution to homelessness and no one is telling you what it is, because they would rather pretend that all they need to do is take donations from developers and then approve housing projects, and that makes everything all better. And that doesn't make anything all better so far. So here's what's wrong. In 2016, a law was passed, Senate Bill 1380, Senate Bill 1380 in 2016, written by then Senator Holly Mitchell, who is now on the LA County Board of Supervisors, that said all housing programs in California must adhere to the Housing First model, Housing First policy. Now, what is that? What it means is that there can be no conditions on housing from any of these programs. So to the extent there's any funding at all from the government, housing programs cannot exclude someone based on drug and alcohol use or criminal record or anything else. Housing first, and then supposedly once there's 4 walls and a ceiling, all the problems magically start to go away. It isn't working. It isn't working. What's happening is you'll have a building where there are people in it who are doing okay, and then you bring in people with these problems, drug and alcohol and criminal problems. Next thing you know, the whole building is in chaos. You've got drug dealers coming to the neighborhood to service their clients, and you've got a problem that you didn't have before, and no way to do anything about it. Because unless they violate the lease in some other way, just the drug and alcohol problem is not enough to evict people. So this is in the law. And that means that all the money we're putting into housing programs is going to enable addiction, which is not helping anybody. This is not solving the problem. The second problem that we could address, we could repeal 1380 and we could fix that, and we could have more control over the success of our housing projects. That would be very helpful. The second thing is the Institution for Mental Disease Exclusion. Now, you've probably never heard of this, but it's one of the central reasons we're having this problem. In 1965, when Lyndon Johnson was president, he signed the Medicaid Act, the Medicaid and Medicare Act. It said that there would be no reimbursement for patient care in a large mental health institution. So for substance abuse, for mental health care, indigent patients who are on Medicaid, and by the way, 1/3 of the state of California is on Medicaid right now. You don't have to be indigent. 1/3 of the state is on Medicaid. The state cannot get reimbursement from the federal government for mental health or substance abuse care in a large hospital. So there are no large hospitals for mental health care. You have little community clinics. If they have more than 16 beds, they can't get reimbursed. What do you hear all the time? We don't have enough beds. We don't have any place to put people. The largest mental health facility in California is the Los Angeles County Jail System. That's horrific. That's horrific. That's appalling for everybody. So what do we need to do? We need to ask the federal government for a waiver from this exclusion. We can get a waiver. This is a policy that was put in place during the Trump administration. And that may be one of the reasons that California won't ask for one. But we could get a waiver. We could build mental health hospitals, high quality, state-of-the-art, well-staffed mental health hospitals. And we could provide the care that people need, not in a jail, not on the streets, not in a hotel, in a hospital, because some people need care. And we should treat them like patients, not tenants. But we're not doing that. So that's the second thing. We could ask for a waiver from the so-called IMD exclusion, Institutions of Mental Disease Exclusion. We could get a waiver, and then we could get funding, and then we could build hospitals. And we need that. And the third thing that we need to do is build shelters. Now, why do we need to build shelters instead of housing? We can't have people camping on the streets. This is unsafe. This is just, it's unhealthful, it's dangerous, it creates a hazard for the community, it's not good for the people who are dying in the encampments, doing drugs in tents. It's horrible. Can't believe you even have to say that in America, but it's horrible. and we shouldn't have camping on the streets. But you can't enforce an anti-camping ordinance in California or anywhere in the Ninth Circuit because, according to the decision in the Martin versus Boise case a few years ago, you can't enforce an anti-camping ordinance unless you have enough shelter beds for everybody. We could build shelters. We could build enough shelters. It's much less expensive than building single apartments at $600,000 a unit, which is what it's averaging in Los Angeles. We could build shelters, and then we could enforce an anti-camping ordinance. But they won't. They won't build shelters. They won't even support the shelters that exist, like the various missions and rescue missions that are here in Los Angeles. They don't get any money because they're not housing, and some of them are religious in nature, so they don't get any funding at all. And that's not helpful. They have sobriety requirements, which is good for the people in the programs, but they can't get any help from the state or city funding. So that's what we need to do. We need to build shelters and enforce an anti-camping ordinance. We need to get a waiver from the IMD exclusion so we can build hospitals. And the first thing that I mentioned is we have to repeal this housing first mandate that requires these programs to accept people who are in complete chaos and need to be somewhere where they're stabilized before they go into housing so that they don't destabilize everybody else. And that's the real solution to homelessness. So what are we doing instead? We're pumping billions of dollars into failed policies and talking about how it's the NIMBY's fault. It's the homeowner's fault for not wanting a giant apartment building for people who are drug addicted next to their kids' elementary school. Oh, how terrible the homeowners are for protesting that. Had that going on in the San Fernando Valley. I don't think it's terrible. I think it's a legitimate concern. If you fill up a building with people who have drug addiction problems and it's right next to an elementary school, obviously it's housing. People can come and go as they please, as they should be able to in housing, but it's a danger to the community to bring drug dealers and drug addicts together on the sidewalk in front of an apartment building next to an elementary school. Why is this controversial? That makes me a NIMBY for not wanting that. I'm concerned about this policy. I'm concerned about the spending. I'm concerned about turning hotels into housing like this. And all of the cities that are being forced to do this by the state program, the Project Home Key, where they're sort of slipping this in and then there's no community approval process because they're using COVID emergency money or for some other reason, there's no local approval process. What's happening? So these cities lose the hotel revenue. They don't have the transient occupancy tax. They don't have the revenue. And then they have a building that is going to need a lot of services. There'll be police calls. There'll be more fires. There'll be more drug services that are needed. All these things are at taxpayer expense. So you lose the revenue, you have the expense. How many times can you do that before you're completely insolvent? We're going to find out in Los Angeles. I understand that the mayor has proposed $1.3 billion of the city budget to buy hotels and turn them into housing for the homeless. It hasn't worked yet, and I don't expect that it will. So with that, let me see. I think we can take questions. Happy to take questions on any subject.
Okay. I would like to start with a question to you, and this would be about the repealing of the death tax.
Okay.
And I would like to know, in your opinion, what do you think is the most important concern about repealing the death tax?
Most important concern is that people should not be taxed out of the property that their parents worked so hard to acquire. This is about regular families. And people are being taxed out of the property that their parents intended to leave to them so they'd have some security. And it's going to force children, the next generation, out of California because people will not be able to pay the bills once those tax bills come in. So the most important thing is that property tax, unlike income tax, which is once on the way in, or sales tax, which is once on the way out, property tax is every year as a condition of keeping what you already own. So if parents work their whole life and they acquire a home and maybe a rental house or maybe a duplex or maybe a small business, an immigrant family that comes to America and buys a restaurant, and they work for 2 generations to build that business and they survive through the pandemic and all the harassment, and then someone passes away and it passes to the next generation. And that property, that small business property, is reassessed to market value. And there's no way that it's going to support that higher tax bill. So that family is going to have to sell that asset. And when you sell that asset in high inflation like we have now, the kids have the cash. The cash is going to lose value to inflation. And the asset will appreciate, but somebody else owns it. So this is really terrible. And the other part of it that's terrible is that people get these letters from the assessor in the mail with the sympathy cards. It's so fast. You get reassessed. If it's a house, you have 1 year to decide whether you're going to move into it and make it your permanent primary residence, or whether you're going to be reassessed to market value. You have 1 year. You shouldn't be making big financial decisions immediately after you lose your parents. Anyone will tell you that, but Prop 19 forces it. So the most important thing is people should not be taxed out of their property just because their parent has died. That's the main thing. So call your lawmakers and tell them that. Say you support SCA 4 and ask them to co-author it and move it forward to protect California families from being taxed out of their property.
Thank you.
Susan, how does the initiative repeal the death tax? How does that work?
Well, what it does is it reverses the part of Prop 19 that took away what was there. So we're sunsetting the provision that sunsetted the provision. We're putting back Prop 58 and Prop 193. That's what it does.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Now, if the death tax initiative is repealed, will that be retroactive? Will it go back to a certain point, or would it just start from that point going forward?
Well, in our initiative, if we end up doing this with signatures, our initiative is retroactive, and people would get their original tax base back, their trended base year value, their factored base year value. They would get their Prop 13 back if they were reassessed. They would not get a refund for the taxes they had to pay in the interim, but they would get the old tax base back. In the SCA 4 language, the legislature didn't do that because I think they were afraid it was too expensive. It might not get votes for whatever reason. But if we have the opportunity to negotiate with the legislature, we will fight to put that back in. So if SCA 4 passes in its current language, it would not be retroactive. But our initiative, if the legislature says no to that and we go to our initiative is retroactive.
Okay,
And
thank you.
Susan, how does the death tax, the way it is now, how does it affect renters?
Well, the way it affects renters is if you are in a building that's owned by a mom and pop landlord, and there are many of them, there are hundreds of thousands of 2 to 4 unit, 5 to 7 unit buildings that are owned by mom and pop landlords and have been for decades. When that generation passes away and the building is reassessed to market value, the taxes will go up so much that a building under rent control will not be a viable business any longer just because of the tax increase. And because, a lot of them are really hanging on by their fingernails anyway, especially after COVID and people couldn't collect rent, they couldn't raise rent. Even under rent control, they couldn't do the minimal increase in rent that was allowed under rent control. So those businesses are just hanging on by their fingernails. And here it would be completely reassessed to market value, which in San Francisco or Los Angeles is crazy high. The new tax bill is 1% of the new market value. And that business is no longer viable. So what's going to happen is that building will be sold. Those tenants will be evicted. The building will probably be demolished and something else will go up in its place, and you will lose those affordable units. So that's how it affects renters. It will gradually reduce the supply of apartments in California, which is not a good idea in the middle of a housing crisis.
Okay. Now, this comes from Cindy Wall. This says, will the Taxpayer Protection Act on the ballot be a yes vote or a no vote?
The Taxpayer Protection Act is a yes vote.
Okay. All right.
It is a yes vote. It's got a lot of stuff in it to close loopholes. It was written by a bunch of lawyers, so it's a little bit difficult to parse out some of it, but take my word for it. It's all good. It all protects taxpayers. It creates more transparency on the ballot where they would have to tell you that a tax is a tax and not call it something else. Things like that. Also, if there's an agency that passes a tax and calls it a fee, the local governing board would have to vote on that. They wouldn't be able to just wash their hands of it and say, oh, it wasn't us. It was the air quality board, or it was Metro, or it was somebody else. No, no, no. They'll have to vote on it because they're accountable to you. So stuff like that, it protects the taxpayers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. This is from Carol Peterson from Brea. How is it that Coronado Island has been able to eliminate or virtually eliminate homelessness? We keep hearing about that happening in that area. Do you know about that?
I have heard that. And there are no shelters on Coronado Island. I think what they're doing is they're transporting people to shelters in San Diego, and then they're enforcing the anti-camping ordinance. So I think they could be sued. That's what's happened to Los Angeles. Los Angeles has been sued a number of times over trying to enforce an anti-camping ordinance. That's how we got started with this. In the Jones settlement, there was an ACLU lawsuit, which the city of Los Angeles settled. And the settlement said, all right, we won't enforce our ordinance against sleeping on the sidewalk anywhere in the city of Los Angeles. Anywhere in the city of Los Angeles, it will be legal to sleep on the sidewalk until we build 1,250 units of housing for the chronically homeless. Well, they built the housing, but they never got out of the consent decree or the settlement. They never got out of it. So they continued to allow people to sleep on the sidewalk everywhere in the city. Now, technically, all those tents are supposed to be cleared away in the morning, but practically, it's impossible. And then there were more settlements that said you can't limit the amount of property that people can store on the sidewalk. And then we started getting sofas and dressers and buildings, and people are just building structures. And saw one with a hot tub. This is it. And the city can't do anything about it because they agreed to this settlement. Oh, that's someone's property, and that you can't restrict how much property they can have on the sidewalk. It's not rational, but that's what the city attorney agreed to. Crazy.
Teresa Speak asks, how can we get a waiver of the IMD to legislation?
The governor has to ask the Department of Health and Human Services in Washington for the waiver. They can just write a letter and ask for the waiver. And a lot of states have done that. We're not one of them.
This is from Fern Somoza. Is there any way we can protect ourselves from hidden meanings linked to the propositions on the ballot?
Hidden meanings?
I think I'm guessing that her question pertains to, so often we read the propositions when they finally come out, and they're so convoluted.
Mm-hmm.
And just like Prop 19, that was marketed as one thing, and the information on people losing their ability to transfer their properties was not broadcast at all.
Right.
So people never really were aware of that. I think that's kind of what she's asking about. How do we protect ourselves from that?
Well, unfortunately, there is quite a science in political consulting and polling that does this to you on purpose. So what's the defense against it? Well, one thing you can do is join the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, and we'll send you stuff on the tax related initiatives and measures and let you know what they are. So if you're not already a member of HJTA, please join, or just sign up for the free email alerts at hjta.org, Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, hjta.org. And while you're there, push the button that says, see your shocking tax bill if we ever lost Prop 13, and put in the value of your house and push the button and make sure you're sitting down. Because when you see how high your taxes would be if we lost Prop 13, if it had never passed. It's unbelievable the effect that inflation has had on property and what that would do to your taxes without Prop 13. Ugh. So the question about how to know what's really on the ballot. I always write about these things in my column, so you can read the Orange County Register or the Los Angeles Daily News online and find that, or write to me, emailed me at susan@susanshelley.com, LLEY, susanshelley.com, and I'll send it to you before an election. Recommendations on how to vote and what they really mean. The other thing to fix it statewide that's really necessary is to take the power to write the titles and summaries away from the elected attorney general and give it to the neutral legislative analyst's office, because they do a pretty good job. They work for the legislature, but they do a pretty balanced, they call the balls and strikes pretty fairly on these things. So in order to get that to happen, you have to amend the Constitution. And in order to amend the Constitution, you have to put something on the ballot. And then what are they going to call that? So this is very complicated to solve this problem. They're going to call it the Kill All the Kittens and Puppies Act, when actually what it does is it just creates neutral ballot titles and summaries. We could probably do that with a one-page petition. So this is another reason that I want to create this grassroots ability. Something else that we could do that I would love to do is voter ID. We could do voter ID on a one-page petition. How fast would you sign that if you could download it right now? How fast would you sign a voter ID law in California to put that on the ballot? I'd sign it fast. I would click download, print, mail, find a stamp. I'd have it in the mail the same hour, because that would solve a lot of problems in California. We have some work to do.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Vicki Graham asks, what do you know about Newsom wanting to tax the people that left California on money they made on their home?
This is the wealth tax. This is ACA 3. Now, this is rather interesting. There's two parts to this wealth tax proposal, which I understand is dead. I understand that this is not going anywhere. But what they proposed, I think it was Alex Lee who proposed it. There was a wealth tax law saying it only applies to people who have, I don't know, $25 million, $50 million, something like that. But then, because it's not constitutional, there was a companion measure that's a constitutional amendment. And here's where it was evil. The constitutional amendment didn't say anything about wealthiness. It didn't say anything about $25 million or $50 million. It said the legislature could define wealth and create a new tax on it and do it by a simple majority. They didn't even need 2/3. And they could raise it later. They could create the tax and then they could raise it later by a simple majority. That would allow the current value of your home to be defined as wealth. And you could be taxed on the current value of your home, not as a property tax, but as a so-called wealth tax administered by the Franchise Tax Board, like income taxes are. So that was that. Now, as far as leaving the state, I believe that that law had a provision in it where for something like 10 years after you left, they could still go after your assets. I don't know that that would be constitutional. The whole thing is sketchy. But in any case, as I understand it, it's not even going to get a hearing this session, and the governor has said he wouldn't sign it. So at the moment, we're safe from that.
Small miracles.
Thank you all for the work you do, keeping
Yeah.
everybody honest. You know, just by showing up to vote, you scare them enough that they aren't going to do that.
I have a question here from Maria Mauro Acosta regarding the mental hospitals back when they were closed. She's asking, she says, I've always heard that then Governor Reagan was blamed for closing the mental health hospitals. And then I've also heard that it was the Ninth Circuit decision that closed them down. Was it only President Johnson's 1965 decision, or was there also a Ninth Circuit decision that closed the hospitals? Do you know about that?
You know, I'm not aware of a Ninth Circuit decision that closed the hospitals, but I can tell you that this one was everybody's fault. This was not Reagan. It was not Johnson. It was everybody's fault. You have to go back to what people believed in 1965. And what they believed in 1965 is that there were these great new psychiatric drugs, and mental hospitals were a very old-fashioned, dark ages kind of thing. People were locked away and it was horrible, which it was. They weren't great. And in this brave new world, everyone would be able to get a prescription at the community clinic and it would solve the problem of mental health. They had great faith in the pharmaceutical industry, and they had great faith in the community clinic model. But by defunding the big hospitals, the institutional hospitals, gradually the counties would not allow any patients to go there. They would send them into general hospitals with mental health problems, which was very bad for the general hospitals because they weren't really set up for that. And it's a specialized kind of thing when people are in need of mental health care. It's not like going in for your appendix. So it was chaotic for the general hospitals. And so what you ended up with by the 1980s, maybe even earlier than that, is you had people on the streets. Do you remember the bag lady character that Lily Tomlin played? Do you remember how that was kind of the woman sitting on the park bench with the shopping bag? That was like the beginning of this. We don't know where to put people because we've closed the facilities. The facilities ended up closing because they were not financially viable because the patients were not going there because there was no reimbursement. So by the time Reagan was closing them, they were a mess. So it was everybody's fault. It's Jack Nicholson's fault. Why is it Jack Nicholson's fault? See, you're ahead of me. It's Jack Nicholson's fault because he's such a fine actor that when he did One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, people lost confidence in institutional care forever. It's Cuckoo's Nest every time because he was so good at that. He's such a fine actor. So it's his fault. It's the pharmaceutical industry's fault for telling people that these drugs could do wonders, but they don't do wonders for everybody. It's not for everybody. There is such a thing as gravely disabling mental illness, and people need care. And so it was everybody. It was the Democrats and the Republicans and the medical profession and the pharmaceutical industry and the general public and Jack Nicholson. We all did this. But the question is, why aren't we fixing it? Why aren't we fixing it? And the answer there is political corruption in many cases, because there are developers who want these grants and loans and points and whatever else, deductions for building this particular kind of housing. And they give a lot of money to politicians. And then the politicians say, it's not a mental health problem. It's not a drug problem. It's a housing problem. And we need housing. And we're off to the races on something that isn't going to work. And that's how you spend $20 billion or $100 billion or $200 billion and only make it worse. That's where we are.
Thank you. Am I off? Oh yeah, I unmuted. Okay. This is from Angela Forster. She writes, Shirley Weber, the Secretary of State appointed by Newsom, didn't she help write that misleading proposition? I'm not sure which one she's referring to. And will it continue to mislead us as she controls the elections in California? So unless we boot her out of office, but her opponent Bernowski didn't get a dime from the Republican Party. Am I correct in all of this?
Well, the Secretary of State does not write the titles and summaries on the propositions. The Secretary of State manages the elections, but she doesn't write the ballot measure material. It's the Attorney General that writes the ballot measure material. So that was Javier Becerra and who we have now. I'm blanking out. Rob Bonta is the Attorney General. So that's who writes the titles and summaries. And they're elected officials. They're partisan elected officials. They're naturally going to be trying to shade things toward either what they believe or who it's going to help. And so that's just a risk. Rob Bonta's been a little more balanced so far than Becerra was. Becerra was more biased, and Kamala Harris, when she was in that job, she was more biased. So far, Rob Bont has been less biased, but it's inherent in the job because it's an elected partisan position. And really, those ballot measure titles and summaries should be completely neutral. They should just say what they are and be neutral and not use poll tested language that, massages people this way or that way. So that's the goal, is to get the legislative analyst's office to write this. So stay tuned. We'll try that one day.
From Elena Thompson, how can we overturn the Boise case law that requires shelters as the only way to get rid of the homeless living on the streets? That's her first question. And then there's a second part, which is what about California SB 7, a terrible bill working its way forward in Sacramento?
Okay, you'll have to tell me which one is SB 7 because I don't remember.
Okay, I don't know. Elena, you're going to have to fill us in on SB 7, but how about the first part of that question?
Okay,
How can we-
I already forgot. What's the first part?
Okay, that's all right. How can we overturn the
Oh, the
Boise
Boise
case law?
decision.
Yeah.
Well, that's a really good question. The Supreme Court had the opportunity to hear that case and chose not to. So that's how the Boise case stands. And before the Boise case, there was the Jones versus Los Angeles case. And this is pretty frustrating because what the Ninth Circuit did in that, the Ninth Circuit ruled against Los Angeles, and then Los Angeles, instead of going to the Supreme Court and fighting it out there, they settled the case. That was you can sleep on the sidewalk anywhere until we build 1,200 units of housing. The part that was a settlement is the ACLU agreed that they would not cite the Jones versus Jones versus Los Angeles case in the Ninth Circuit as a precedent ever again. So what happened? There was an almost identical case in Idaho, Martin versus Boise, and the Ninth Circuit quoted all the language from the decision that wasn't supposed to be cited anymore as a precedent as part of the settlement. So the Boise case essentially is the Jones versus Los Angeles case, almost a copy and paste of it. And so we're stuck with that. The Supreme Court wouldn't hear it. How do we get rid of it? Well, you'd have to have a city that was sued. Like, let's say, for example, Coronado was sued, which could happen. If Coronado said, we will pay whatever it takes for lawyers for as long as it takes, and we will fight all the way to the Supreme Court, and we will say that we have a compelling reason, that's the magic word, we have a compelling reason to enforce our health and safety laws. So even if there is a fundamental right to sleep on the sidewalk under certain conditions, we have a compelling reason for saying you can't do it. And that is called strict scrutiny. That's the legal standard of strict scrutiny, the compelling reason versus the fundamental right. And then you fight it out. And then you convince 5 of the 9 justices that the city has to have the power to enforce basic health and safety laws against camping on the sidewalk. And that's how you overturn Boise. It's got to be done with the Supreme Court. It's a long way from here.
Thank you for taking my question, Susan, and thank you for all of your great spokesmanship. It's really wonderful. And I'm a member of the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. We need to keep you guys going and fighting for us as we fight for ourselves. So the second part of that question was, do you know much about SB 7 and where that's going in the legislature? And that's a terrible proposal, again, tied to homelessness in California, where a new state senator, happens to be from my hometown in San Diego, wants to tie homeless housing numbers to the RHNA numbers, the state contested numbers, and says that if you have to build 5,000 units in your California city per state law, which everybody's fighting, that you also have to have a certain percentage of homeless shelter beds. And that's Senate Bill 7. And I would really encourage everyone to get in the legislative portal and fight that one. But I'm wondering if you have any current info on that, even though I realize you're focusing on taxes, and thank you for that.
Well, thank you
I
for
like
bringing
the homeless topic too.
Yeah, thank you for bringing it to my attention because I wasn't aware of that bill, but I can tell you if it requires shelter beds rather than apartment units, it has the silver lining that it will allow the enforcement of an anti-camping ordinance under the Ninth Circuit's Martin versus Boise decision, if it's really shelter beds. Where we've been getting into trouble is requirements for housing units where you have people living in tents and you're asking the taxpayers to essentially build them their own condo with a walk-in medicine cabinet and wraparound services right down the hall. It's just incredibly expensive. And in Los Angeles, they're taking the position that people have the right to housing wherever they are camping. So right now, there's a huge encampment on the border of Beverly Hills in a neighborhood called Beverly Grove, very expensive. And people are camping on San Vicente Boulevard in the median strips, in the sidewalks, on the grassy areas of landscaping. And the city is saying, well, we have to find them housing in this council district. Well, there isn't any affordable housing in that. The whole city can't afford to live in that area. This is very expensive real estate. So what kind of crazy message does that send to people who are working for a living and paying for their own housing? It's as if you work for a living, you have to live wherever you can afford, but if you pitch a tent, you can live in Beverly Hills. This is craziness.
I agree. Thank you for taking my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to go back a little bit upon with the first subject that you talked about, and it says, can a trust be set up to avoid reassessment of our properties upon death?
I'm glad you asked that question because trusts do not protect you from property tax reassessment. They never did. What was protecting people from property tax reassessment was the parent-child transfer exclusion, not the trust. Because assessors look through the trust to see who is the present beneficial owner. That's the term they use. So depending on what kind of a trust it is, whoever really controls it is the owner. And the property tax reassessment is based on the ownership, not the trust. So that's the bad news. It wrecked a lot of people's plans.
Okay, is there any way possible to make that happen where, you know, you can avoid that, the property, or can you save your property some other way?
If you are willing to pay a lot of lawyers, you can do an LLC. You can set it up where the property doesn't have one owner. And then if you transfer it and it's less, if you're transferring ownership of less than 50%, it won't meet the definition of a change of ownership. But that's very complicated and it requires professional help. So if you're in a position to put properties in an LLC and you have a number of kids and none of them will get 50%, that might work for you. But be sure you wear a helmet, wear a protective cup, and get a lawyer. Very dangerous, very tricky.
Okay. We are almost at the end of your time. I'm going to ask just one last question, which is from Carrie Nelson. And this is just asking for people that came in a little bit after we started. Could you just give like a real quick recap of SCA4 and
Sure.
Thanks, Susan.
Sure. SCA4 will repeal the death tax that was in Proposition 19. There are two ways to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot, and this is one of them. If it gets a 2/3 vote in each house of the legislature, it will be on the ballot, and perhaps as early as March 5th of next year. If we do it with signatures, it'll be on the ballot in November. But if we do it with the legislature, it could be on the ballot even earlier. So what you have to do is call your representatives. And if you're not sure who they are after redistricting or what their numbers are, go to findyourrep.legislature.ca.gov. Find your rep, all one word, findyourrep.legislature.ca.gov, and look them up and ring the phones and tell them yes on SCA4. Ask them to be co-authors and move it forward, because that will put back the old rules before Prop 19 so that parents and children can transfer a home of any value and up to $1 million of assessed value of other property, a limited amount of other property like a rental home or a duplex or a small business property, a home of any value, a limited amount of other property without reassessment. And that will allow people who are climbing the economic ladder not to be kicked off of it, because we don't want people to be taxed out of their property when a parent dies. That's just horrible. That's the answer. SCA 4, it's in the Senate right now. It needs a 2/3 vote in the Senate and a 2/3 vote in the Assembly. Call your representatives in both houses and ask them to become co-authors of SCA 4. And that will help. It's moving. Special hearing scheduled for May 10th. So if you want to go to Sacramento and be there for the hearing, let us know.
Mm.
Thank you. Can I ask one more thing?
Sure.
Can you give the link to, or not necessarily the link, but to the repeal, the death tax? Is there a website for that? Can I
You know,
get that?
there is. It's repealthedeathtax.com. It's left over from when we did our signature drive last year, but we're going to get it updated again. Repealthedeathtax.com.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Janet, I think
Wow.
it's
Yeah.
all you now.
It
Yep.
is. I am just riveted by all this. I've done so many notes,
Good.
taking them all down. But Susan, I cannot thank you enough for this just full of information evening. And it's heartening to know that there are people like you who are keeping your eyes on the ball and giving us this important information, because all of us are kind of lost in this maze. It's meant to be confusing.
Yes, it is. Yes, it
People
is.
like you are untangling that. So I know everyone who came tonight is just feeling so glad they came and glad that they heard you. And we're so glad that you have been so generous with your time, as you always are with the CFRW events and clubs. And we just wish you the best. But everybody follow through on what she said. This has got to be activism to make sure that we win in these cases. Otherwise, California is just not going to be California anymore. So I do so appreciate it. And I want to thank our team, Gretchen Cox, first VP, Nancy Wofford, third VP. And I want to thank Sherry. Are you on here, Sherry? She's our webmaster, Sherry Gillis.
I am.
Wonderful. We thank you, and we thank Audrey Voigt, who wears more hats than I can count, but she helps with these technical evenings and getting the Zooms out, getting the invitations out. And we are just thrilled to have had you tonight.
Well, it's been a complete pleasure. Thank you so much, Janet.
Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much,
Susan.
everybody. We do appreciate. Turn off
Thank
your mute.
you.
Clap.
Thank you,
I can hear you.
Susan.
Thank you.
Thank
You guys
so
take
much.
care. Everybody
All
be
right.
well.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Next
Bye-bye.
one next week.
Thank you so
As
much.
Gretchen will tell you, watch for that. All right. Good night, everybody. Thank
Good
you
night, Janet.
very much. Good night.
Hi, Janet. Thank you.